Her stomach growled so loud it hurt, yet she slid her only plate of food across the table. "Please," she whispered, "you need it more." The old couple froze, tears burning in their eyes. She walked away empty, not knowing that one choice, one act of kindness, would unleash a chain of events no one could have predicted. Because the very next morning, someone with more power than she could imagine would be standing at her door. Before we jump in, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what kind of story do you crave next? Drop your answer in the comments below. If stories like this grip your heart and refuse to let go, well, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I've got another powerful story coming your way tomorrow, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Now, let's get into today's story. The evening sun bled into the skyline, casting a dull orange over the neighborhood where Ayana lived. Cracks ran down the walls of her small apartment, the kind of cracks that spoke of years of neglect. Landlords who never returned calls, ceilings patched with tape and prayers. In the corner sat a little wooden table, its surface scarred from too many meals scraped together out of nothing. On that table tonight was a single plate, half a portion really, rice and beans stretched thin to make it seem like more. Ayana hummed softly as she folded her clothes, not because she was happy, but because silence had a way of pressing down too heavy in these four walls. Her belly growled, sharp and insistent, yet she ignored it. Hunger had become an old companion, sometimes cruel, sometimes just there. She glanced at the plate, her lips tightening, as though looking too long might weaken her resolve. Across town, in a world stitched together with glass towers and clean lines, Nathaniel Cross sat in his penthouse, the skyline glittering behind him. His phone buzzed with notifications, business deals, social invites, a string of unanswered messages, but he barely glanced at them. A half-finished glass of wine rested at his elbow, untouched. The leather chair beneath him looked more like a throne than a seat, but Nathaniel felt no king. For all the wealth spread before him, silence lived here too, heavier than gold, sharper than hunger. He opened his fridge and stared at shelves stocked with imported cheeses, fine cuts of meat, desserts wrapped in gold foil. He closed the door again. Appetite was a stranger these days. It wasn't food he craved. It was something he couldn't buy, something he'd spent years pretending he didn't need. Meanwhile, Ayana stepped into the evening air, carrying that single plate wrapped carefully in a cloth. The street was alive with sounds. Children playing tag, a stray dog barking, the distant hum of cars heading toward places she could only imagine. She clutched the food tighter, her knuckles white, as though the plate itself was both a gift and a wound. She saw them then, an old couple huddled on the curb, their hands clasped together as though holding one another was the only thing keeping them upright. Their clothes hung loose, their faces tired, eyes dimmed by a hunger far older than hers. Ayana's steps slowed. Every part of her body screamed at her to keep walking, to go home, to finally eat. But she didn't. She couldn't. Her breath hitched. The cloth loosened in her hands. And before she could stop herself, Ayana crossed the street. Nathaniel, in his tower, looked down at the city below. He didn't know her yet. He didn't know that in the maze of cracked pavements and flickering streetlights, one girl was about to make a choice that would change both their lives. Ayana pushed open the chipped wooden door of the little eatery tucked on the corner of her block. A soft bell clinked overhead, though its sound was dull, as though it had grown tired of being ignored. The air inside smelled of fried plantain and spiced stew, the kind of smell that teased the senses and made the belly clench in longing. She hesitated at the threshold, her hand tightening around the few coins in her palm, thumb brushing over each one as though to reassure herself they were real. The place wasn't grand. It had mismatched chairs and fading posters on the wall, menus scribbled in chalk that smudged under greasy fingers. Yet to Ayana, it was a palace because it meant warmth, food, a chance to sit and feel like life hadn't completely stripped her down. She walked toward the counter, head bowed slightly, not wanting to meet the cashier's eyes. People had a way of looking at you when they thought they knew your struggle, and she didn't want pity to be part of her meal. "One small portion," she whispered, laying down the coins carefully, like they were fragile. The cashier scooped them up, counting quickly, giving her a short nod. A plate was slid across, steaming rice, a small piece of fish, sauce pooled at the side. It wasn't much, but to Ayana, it was everything. She carried it to a corner table, sat down, and let the steam rise against her face like a bomb. Her stomach twisted, sharp and impatient, but she forced herself to wait, to savor the sight before she took the first bite. That was when she noticed them. Across the room, near the wall where the shadows gathered, sat an elderly couple. Their clothes were clean but frayed, their hands laced together tightly on the table, as though they were holding on to each other instead of food. The man's shoulders slumped forward, his skin pale under the flickering light bulb. The woman's eyes lingered on the plates being carried past them, her lips pressed together as though swallowing a hunger she dared not name. They had no food before them, no drinks, nothing. Just the silence of their shame. Ayanna felt her fork hover above her plate. She wanted to look away, to pretend she hadn't noticed, to tell herself this was her one chance to eat and she deserved it. But their eyes betrayed them. The woman's gaze flickered to Ayanna's plate for the briefest second, then darted away, cheeks flushed as if caught in a crime. The man squeezed her hand, murmuring something Ayanna couldn't hear, though she imagined it was a promise that hunger wouldn't last forever. Her throat tightened. The fork clattered softly against the plate as her hand trembled. Inside her, two voices fought. One pleading, "You need this, you've gone without enough," the other whispering, "But so have they." The air seemed heavier, the smells of food sharper, the growl in her stomach louder. She lifted the plate slowly, each movement deliberate, as though she were lifting not just food, but the very weight of choice. She stood, her legs unsteady, and walked across the room. The couple looked up in surprise, confusion written on their faces as she stopped at their table. Her voice was soft, almost shy, but steady enough to carry. "Please," she said, sliding the plate toward them. "You need this more than I do." The woman blinked rapidly, tears threatening to spill. The man straightened, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to protest, but the hunger in his eyes betrayed him. For a moment, no one moved. The eatery's hum seemed to fade. Even the clink of cutlery elsewhere sounded distant. "Child," the woman whispered, her voice breaking, "we can't." Ayanna forced a smile, the kind that hurt more than it comforted. "You can. Please. It's nothing." Her belly twisted hard, reminding her it wasn't nothing, it was everything. But she ignored it. She watched as the woman finally reached out, trembling fingers pulling the plate closer. The man muttered a quiet blessing under his breath, though his voice shook so badly it almost dissolved into silence. Ayanna stepped back, her arms suddenly feeling empty. She turned and walked quickly toward the door before they could thank her, before she lost her nerve, before her body betrayed her with the sound of its aching hunger. Outside, the night air hit her face, cool and unforgiving. Her legs felt hollow as she walked down the street, every step heavier than the last. Her stomach cramped, her body weak, but her chest felt strangely lighter. As though in losing something, she had found a kind of strength that no one could take. Behind her, inside the eatery, the old couple ate slowly, reverently, as though each bite was sacred. They didn't know her name, and she didn't wait to learn theirs. All that remained was the silence that stretched between the act and the consequence, a silence filled with unspoken gratitude, with invisible threads weaving fates together. Ayanna didn't know it yet, but that single sacrifice, her only meal, given without hesitation, was not the end of her hunger, but the beginning of something far greater. That night, Ayanna lay on her thin mattress, staring up at the ceiling where the paint had peeled into shapes she often pretended were constellations. Her stomach twisted with sharp pangs, louder than the distant hum of traffic drifting in through the cracked window. She pressed her hands to her belly, as if that could silence it, but hunger was relentless. It gnawed at her, mocking her sacrifice. "Foolish," she whispered to herself, the word bitter on her tongue. She turned to the wall, squeezing her eyes shut. Kindness didn't pay the landlord. Kindness didn't buy medicine. Kindness didn't feed you when your body screamed for food. And yet, even as regret coiled tight in her chest, another voice rose up, softer but unyielding. "They ate. They are not hungry tonight because of you." The memory of the woman's trembling hands lifting the plate, the man's cracked voice whispering a blessing. It wrapped around her, not soothing the hunger, but quieting the ache in her heart. She would not take it back. She couldn't. Somewhere across town, in a part of the neighborhood she rarely visited, the old couple sat together on a worn bench outside their building, their faces illuminated by the flicker of a streetlight. Their bodies were fragile, but their spirits brimmed with warmth as they recounted the girl's gesture. The woman's voice trembled with awe. She gave us her meal, just like that. No hesitation. The man nodded, his eyes wet. There is goodness left in this world. We must not keep it to ourselves. The next day, the couple carried her story like a torch. They spoke of her to a neighbor, who repeated it to a shopkeeper, who passed it to a friend. Each retelling added a shade of wonder, as though Ayana were more than just a girl in patched shoes. She was proof that kindness had not vanished from the earth. By evening, the tale had woven itself into whispers in the marketplace. A woman buying bread leaned close to the vendor. "Did you hear about the girl who gave up her only plate of food for 2 elders?" The vendor shook his head in disbelief. Such things don't happen anymore. Yet he told the story again to another, the ripple widening, untraceable, unstoppable. Ayana, unaware, woke the next morning with the same hunger clawing at her, but also with a stubborn pride stitched into her chest. She kept her chin high as she walked past the eatery, though her body screamed for the scent of rice and stew. She clenched her fists to keep from turning in, muttering to herself, "No, I will not beg. I will not regret." Doubt shadowed her resolve, but she held fast. She had made her choice. She would not let the world see her wonder if it was worthless. At the same time, her story slipped into places she could not imagine. A journalist overheard the rumor while waiting for a cab, jotting it down in his notebook as something worth following. A community worker mentioned it in passing to a friend who, by chance, had ties to wealthier circles. Invisible lines stretched outward, like threads of fate, drawing ever closer to someone who had never known hunger but desperately longed to know meaning. Nathaniel Cross scrolled absently through his phone late that evening, restless, detached. His feeds were cluttered with luxury and hollow smiles, until one headline caught his eye. "The girl who gave away her only meal." He paused, thumb hovering, reading the brief paragraph that carried no name, only a description. The selflessness of a young woman who chose compassion over her own need. Something shifted in him, a crack running through the armor of indifference he had worn for years. He didn't know why, but he read the piece again. And again. Back in her tiny room, Ayana whispered into the dark, her voice almost breaking. "Does it matter?" She wasn't asking anyone, yet the silence seemed to answer with both cruelty and hope. She pulled her blanket tight, though it barely reached her shoulders, and told herself she could not afford hope. Hope was a luxury, like fine wine and polished glass towers, beautiful, fleeting, and never meant for people like her. Still, no matter how tightly she tried to seal it away, a flicker remained. The act replayed in her mind, the old woman's eyes widening, the man's cracked voice blessing her. That small moment had weight. It was hers, and though she could not see it, though she tried with all her might to resist believing in more, her kindness was no longer her secret. It was becoming a story that lived in the mouths of strangers, finding its way into the heart of a man whose world was built on everything but love. Would you have given up your only meal to feed strangers, even if it meant going hungry yourself? Leave your thoughts below. I'd love to know. The morning light crept reluctantly through Ayana's thin curtains, streaking the cracked walls with pale gold. She stretched, her body sluggish from the hollow ache that had lingered all night, when suddenly a sound startled her. The firm, deliberate knock of someone at the door. She froze. No one ever came for her. For a long moment she stayed still, listening, wondering if it was a mistake. But then it came again, louder this time. Reluctantly, she rose, tightening the knot on her faded robe, padding barefoot across the cold floor. When she opened the door, the sight before her rooted her to the spot. A tall man stood there, his suit too fine for these broken streets, shoes polished to a shine that reflected the morning sun. His eyes, sharp, assessing, but with a flicker of something softer, studied her quietly. Nathaniel Cross, though she did not yet know his name, looked out of place, as if he had stepped into the wrong story. "Are you Ayana?" His voice was deep, careful, almost rehearsed. Her instinct bristled. Strangers didn't show up at her door, least of all ones dressed like him. "Who's asking?" she replied, arms crossed tight against her chest. He cleared his throat, visibly unsettled by the suspicion in her gaze. "My name is Nathaniel. I heard about what you did. At the eatery. With the couple." His words were measured, almost cautious, as though afraid she might slam the door in his face. Her heart skipped, but her pride sharpened. Why does that matter to you? He hesitated, searching for words. Because not many people would give away their only meal. I wanted to see for myself, and to offer help if you'd accept it. There it was, the word she despised. Help. It stung her ears like pity disguised as generosity. She straightened, chin lifting defiantly. I didn't do it for anyone to notice. And I don't need anything from you. Her voice carried more steel than she felt inside. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy taut. Then, as if guided by something outside his control, Nathaniel stepped back slightly, hands raised in surrender. I'm not here to insult you. Maybe just walk with me. Let me understand. Against every instinct, she found herself hesitating. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps exhaustion, or perhaps the faint, disarming earnestness in his tone. Reluctantly, she pulled the door shut behind her, her bare feet slipping into worn sandals. Fine, but don't think you can fix my life with a wallet. The day unfolded awkwardly at first. He followed her through the neighborhood, his polished shoes sinking into mud puddles as she maneuvered streets she knew by heart. She stopped at the small store to buy soap with her last coins, and he blinked in disbelief at how carefully she counted change, how the shopkeeper's sympathy weighed heavier than the goods she carried. Later, rain began to fall, sudden and unforgiving. She led him into her apartment, roof leaking in steady drips into pots arranged like a strange orchestra. He glanced around, stunned by the sparseness, the frayed blanket, the peeling paint, the single chair. You live here? He asked before he could stop himself. Her eyes snapped to his, sharp as a blade. Yes. Surprised it's not a penthouse. The bitterness in her tone was a shield, daring him to pity her. Nathaniel, chastened, lowered his gaze. No, I didn't know people lived with so little. People like me live with less every day, she said flatly, folding her arms. You just don't see it. The clash between them was constant. His disbelief at hardships he couldn't fathom, her anger at being an object of fascination. Yet as the hours passed, something subtle began to shift. When she worked her long shift at the laundromat, he sat quietly in the corner, watching as she lugged heavy bags with a determination that humbled him. When she fixed a leak in her sink with nothing but tape and patience, he saw resilience where he had expected despair. Their worlds were colliding, unwillingly bound by the day's circumstances, yet neither could quite walk away. For every barb she threw, he answered with silence or sincerity. For every wall she built, he found a crack, not with money, but with questions that carried no judgment, only a strange, searching curiosity. And though pride still burned hot in her, and wealth still felt like a chasm between them, Ayanna found herself wondering, why would a man with everything follow her into a world with nothing? The question lingered in Ayanna's chest like a stone she couldn't swallow, even as she tried to shake it off. That evening, the rain had eased, but Nathaniel was still there, sitting awkwardly in the lone chair of her apartment, his polished shoes now scuffed, his jacket draped neatly over his arm. She had expected him to leave hours ago. Men like him didn't last long in spaces like hers. But he hadn't moved, as though waiting for something she couldn't quite name. You must have better things to do, she muttered, lighting the small stove to boil water for tea. Not today, he replied quietly, eyes tracing the water stains running across her ceiling. Sometimes, better things aren't what they seem. His words confused her, but she said nothing, stirring the kettle until the silence thickened. And then, like a crack in a dam, the quiet broke. You want to know why I gave them my food? She asked, voice low, almost as if speaking to herself. She didn't wait for him to answer. Because I know what it feels like to be hungry, to watch others eat and pretend you're not starving. I know what it's like to be invisible in plain sight. That couple, they reminded me of my mother and father. She turned, leaning against the counter, eyes unfocused as memories spilled into the room. I lost them young. Sickness took my mom first, then grief took my dad not long after. I was 12. Nobody came. No one asked if I'd eaten, or if I had a place to sleep. I learned to survive by being small, by not asking. People don't see what they don't want to. So when I saw them in that cafe, I just couldn't pretend. Her voice cracked, but she quickly covered it with a shaky laugh. It wasn't charity. It was defiance, a way of saying, I may have nothing, but I still have the power to give. Nathaniel sat motionless, his jaw tight, his fingers clasped together. Her story lodged itself in him like a shard of glass, cutting into places he rarely let himself feel. Slowly, he exhaled, and when he spoke, his voice carried an unfamiliar fragility. My father walked out when I was 6, he admitted, surprising even himself. Left without a word. My mother worked herself raw to keep us afloat, and I hated how the world looked at us, like we were less. When I built my company, my wealth, it was all armor. A way to say, now you see me. Now you can't ignore me. But it doesn't fill the rooms at night. Money doesn't ask how you're doing. It doesn't care when you fail the people who matter. Ayanna blinked, her defenses faltering as she studied him in the dim light. For the first time, she didn't see the millionaire. She saw a boy left behind, carrying wounds dressed in tailored suits. Is that why you came here? She asked softly. He nodded once. When I heard about you, about what you did, it wasn't just generosity I saw. It was courage. The kind I never had. You gave away the one thing you needed most. I've spent years clinging to what I have, terrified someone might take it. Maybe I wanted to understand why you're stronger than me. Her breath hitched, though she tried to mask it. No one had ever called her strong before. To most, she was a shadow, a girl scraping by, irrelevant. And here was this man, this impossibly wealthy man, looking at her as though she held something he lacked. She lowered herself onto the edge of her bed, arms resting on her knees. Strength doesn't feel like this, she whispered. Strength would have been keeping that plate for myself, not going to bed hungry again. Or maybe, Nathaniel countered gently, leaning forward, strength is doing the thing that costs you most, because your heart won't let you do otherwise. The kettle whistled, startling them both. She turned quickly, pouring water into 2 chipped mugs, placing one in front of him. As their fingers brushed, brief and unintentional, silence stretched once more. But this time it wasn't heavy. It was fragile, like glass balancing on the edge of a table, waiting to fall or be caught. He sipped, wincing slightly at the bitter tea, and she smirked faintly. Not exactly what you're used to, huh? Maybe it's what I needed, he replied. They sat there for a long while, the room filled with the soft patter of water dripping into pots. The space between them no longer felt like a battlefield of pride and mistrust, but a quiet bridge built on shared scars. And in that moment, she realized his presence didn't feel like pity anymore. It felt like recognition. 2 people from different worlds, carrying the same invisible wounds of abandonment, finally seen. Would you have given up your only meal for someone else, even if it meant going hungry that night? Share your heart in the comments below. The night passed more easily than she expected, though her stomach gnawed at her with the same familiar emptiness. Yet when she woke, there was a strange lightness in her chest, as though she had been given something invisible, something she couldn't name. Nathaniel was gone by morning, leaving only his jacket folded neatly on her rickety chair and a note that read, "Be ready by noon." She almost crumpled it up, almost told herself it was another test from the universe designed to remind her of her place. But something in his handwriting, the steady way the letters curved, kept her from tearing it. At noon, when the knock came, she found him standing there with 2 grocery bags in his hands, his smile awkward, uncertain. "I didn't know what you liked," he admitted, lifting the bags. "So I bought a little of everything." She laughed, shaking her head as she stepped aside to let him in. "You call this a little?" she asked, staring at the overflowing bags filled with fresh vegetables, bread, even small treats she hadn't tasted in years. Together they unpacked the food, her small kitchen suddenly alive with color and fragrance. She showed him how to cut onions properly, scolding him when he tried to use the knife like it was a business deal he could rush through. He made her laugh harder than she had in years when the onions brought tears streaming down his face, and he declared, "This is cruel and unusual punishment." When the stew finally simmered, they sat side by side at the table. For once, there was enough, more than enough. As she took her first bite, warmth spread through her body, not just from the food but from the company. Nathaniel watched her quietly, almost reverently, as though her joy in something so simple was more valuable than anything money had ever bought him. "You look alive," he said softly. She lowered her spoon, meeting his gaze. "That's because I finally remember what alive feels like." The afternoon unfolded like a dream. After the meal, they walked through the marketplace, Nathaniel sticking out like a polished coin in the dusty alleys, but somehow not caring. She teased him when he tried bargaining and ended up paying triple, and he laughed at himself, shrugging like a man who didn't mind the loss. He carried her bags without protest, the weight looking strange in his manicured hands, but grounding him in ways he hadn't expected. Later, back in her apartment, she pulled out an old photo album, edges frayed and pages worn. He leafed through the faded pictures, her as a child holding her mother's hand, her father smiling before the sickness took him. She pointed out stories hidden in those captured moments, her voice softer, lighter. "Your strength was born here," Nathaniel murmured, tapping one photo where her younger self stood in clothes 2 sizes too big, chin lifted defiantly. She smiled, though her eyes misted. "And your loneliness was born in rooms filled with everything money could buy." He nodded, the truth striking harder than he cared to admit. That night, as they cooked again, laughed again, breathed again, something fragile sparked between them. Not pity, not obligation, but recognition, admiration, even tenderness. The walls she had built to keep out disappointment began to crumble, brick by cautious brick. She dared to imagine mornings like this becoming normal. He dared to imagine his wealth being less about empire and more about sharing moments like these. As she leaned back in her chair, smiling at something silly he'd said, Nathaniel studied her with quiet wonder. To him, her resilience was more beautiful than any jewel he had ever bought. To her, his presence no longer felt like a storm, but a steady light, warm and grounding. For the first time, Ayanna allowed herself to dream of something beyond survival. And for the first time, Nathaniel felt like he had touched something real, something worth more than every fortune he'd ever built. The evening deepened, and the hum of the city outside Ayanna's window softened into a lullaby. Inside, her tiny apartment glowed with warmth it had never known before. Nathaniel leaned against the wall, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hair slightly out of place from helping her wash dishes. It startled her, how ordinary he looked in that moment. Not a man who owned companies, estates, and a reputation larger than life, but a man with soap suds on his hands and a crooked smile that made her forget to breathe. She offered him tea, the cheap kind she usually drank alone to chase away hunger. He accepted it as though it were a rare delicacy, cradling the chipped mug between his hands. They sat across from each other, the silence no longer heavy but tender, almost sweet. "Do you always laugh this much?" he asked, his voice low, curious. Her lips curved. "No, I'd almost forgotten how." The words hit him harder than he expected. He realized then that every smile she gave wasn't careless. It was precious, earned against the weight of a life that had given her little reason to laugh. The next day, they ventured out again, this time to the riverside where street vendors sold roasted corn and children chased each other along the water's edge. He bought her a cob of corn, and she shook her head, insisting she could buy her own. But when he pressed it into her hand anyway, she smiled around her first bite, the butter smearing at the corner of her lip. Without thinking, he reached to wipe it away, then froze, startled by his own impulse. She saw the hesitation, the gentleness in his eyes, and for a moment the world stilled. "Thank you," she whispered, not just for the food, not just for the gesture, but for noticing her. Later, as they strolled through the market, she tugged him toward a stall that sold cheap fabric scraps. She picked up a piece of bright red cloth, held it against his chest, and grinned. "Too bold for you," she teased. He laughed, the sound freer than it had been in years, and bought it anyway. That night, he tied it around his wrist like a ridiculous bracelet. "Now you can't say I never listened," he told her. The sight made her laugh until tears spilled down her cheeks. Under the streetlights on their walk back, something shifted. They didn't speak much, but the silence was alive, not empty. He glanced at her, watching how the lamplight softened her features, how her eyes carried both sorrow and fire. She caught his gaze and didn't look away. When they reached her door, she hesitated, fingers brushing against his sleeve. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said softly. He met her eyes. "I know. That's why I want to." She turned away quickly, fumbling with her keys, because if she held his gaze any longer, her heart might betray her. Inside, though, a warmth spread that no meal could satisfy. The days that followed were stitched together with small joys. Cooking disasters where he burned the rice and she teased him mercilessly. Quiet afternoons where they simply sat, her sewing by the window, him pretending to read but really watching her. Laughter over silly things, her imitation of his business voice, his attempt to mimic her sharp bargaining in the market. Each moment chipped away at the distance between their worlds. For the first time in years, Ayanna allowed herself to dream, not of riches, but of mornings where she wasn't alone, of laughter echoing in her small kitchen. For Nathaniel, her resilience became beauty itself, her strength something he both admired and envied. In her presence, the wealth that once defined him seemed trivial, almost hollow. She grounded him, tethered him to a reality that felt more precious than anything his fortune had ever purchased. That night, as they shared a simple dinner, she lifted her gaze to him and whispered, "It's strange. I don't feel invisible anymore." He reached across the table, brushing his fingers against hers with a gentleness that made her chest ache. "That's because you were never invisible. The world just refused to see." In that fragile moment, a spark of healing flickered, small, trembling, but undeniably real. Do you believe love can be born in the simplest moments? Burnt rice, laughter in a kitchen, a shared silence under streetlights? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear. The next morning began the way many others had over the last week. Soft sunlight spilling into the room, the smell of tea brewing, and a quiet comfort that had started to feel dangerously natural. Ayanna hummed as she set the table, not realizing Nathaniel was still by the window, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low, hurried, almost desperate, but one word cut through the air like a blade. "Publicity." She froze, the mug slipping in her grip. The word echoed inside her head, warping everything they had built. She took a step closer, heart pounding, trying to hear more. "Yes, it's working," Nathaniel murmured. "People love a redemption story. The headlines are already shifting. Millionaire seen giving back. It's good for the image." Her breath caught, a sharp stab in her chest. She wanted to burst in, to demand he explain, but the weight of the betrayal held her still. Every laugh, every meal, every gentle word, they all twisted into something else now, something tainted. When he finally hung up, turning to find her standing there, the guilt in his eyes was immediate, unguarded. "Ayanna." She shook her head, voice breaking. "So that's what this was? A show? A charity project for your empire?" "No," he said quickly, stepping forward. "It started that way maybe, but it's not anymore. You have to believe me." Her laugh was bitter, sharp. "Believe you? After you just admitted it's good for your image? Do you know what it feels like to be reduced to a headline? To be someone's redemption arc instead of a person?" His jaw tightened, hurt flickering in his eyes. "And do you know what it feels like to offer everything and still be seen as a fraud? To have someone look at you and believe you're only capable of selfishness?" Her fists trembled at her sides. "I never asked for your help. I never asked to be your good deed. I shared my life with you, Nathaniel. My scars, my dreams. And you," her voice cracked, tears burning down her cheeks, "you turned them into material for your reputation." He flinched as though her words had struck him physically. "That's not what I meant to do. But that's what you did." The silence between them was heavier than any hunger she'd ever known. His hands fell uselessly to his sides, his wealth, his status, his words, all powerless against the wall she had rebuilt in an instant. She turned away, her shoulders rigid, her body trembling with fury and grief. "Get out," she whispered. "Ayanna, get out." His breath caught, but he obeyed. The door clicked shut behind him, and the small apartment that had been filled with warmth now felt colder than ever. Nathaniel walked the streets alone, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement, his chest hollow. For years he had convinced himself no one wanted him for who he was, only for what he had. And now, even here, even with her, he was back in the same place, unwanted, mistrusted, unseen. Ayanna curled up on her bed, clutching the edge of her blanket. Anger churned in her veins, but beneath it was a deeper wound, the fear that she had been right all along. That kindness was only ever a transaction, that love was a story meant for others, never for her. She had opened her heart, and it had been turned into someone else's gain. Both of them, alone in their separate spaces, felt the weight of the fracture. The meals they had shared, the laughter, the silent promises, it all felt like a cruel memory now, something too fragile to have ever lasted. Do you think trust, once broken this deeply, can ever be rebuilt? Or does betrayal leave a scar that love cannot heal? Comment below with your thoughts. I'm curious what you'd do. Silence pressed against the walls of Ayana's apartment until it felt like she couldn't breathe. The chair where Nathaniel had once sat seemed accusatory, a ghost of laughter and warmth she couldn't banish. She told herself she had done the right thing, that pride mattered more than pity, that dignity meant not letting anyone make her feel small. But her chest ached in a way that dignity couldn't soothe. She turned the memory of his voice over and over in her head, those words about image, about headlines, and wondered if she had thrown away something fragile and real because she was too afraid of being used again. Nathaniel wasn't faring any better. His penthouse gleamed with perfection, but the shine had never felt hollower. He wandered from room to room, glass of whiskey in hand, not drinking, just holding it, as though it could anchor him. Every surface reflected his success back at him, but none of it meant anything. Not when the chair across from his dining table was empty. Not when the echo of her laugh no longer filled his walls. He thought of the meals they had shared, the nights of easy silence, her teasing him over burnt rice. He thought of her resilience, her pride, her fire. And for the first time in years, he felt truly poor. Both of them wrestled with their choices. She told herself kindness was a curse, that it only ever left her weaker. He told himself wealth was a cage, trapping him in the role of benefactor instead of man. Yet under their defenses lurked longing, raw, undeniable, persistent. She missed the way he had looked at her as though she mattered. He missed the way she made him feel like he belonged. 2 days passed like this, thick with regret and stubborn silence. Then one evening, Nathaniel sat at his desk and began to write. Not business memos, not contracts, but a letter. He wrote about his shame, about how wrong he had been to let her believe she was anything less than extraordinary. He admitted the truth, that it had started as a shallow gesture, but that her strength, her kindness, her sacrifice had torn through his walls and shown him what it meant to live. He wrote until his hand cramped, then folded the paper carefully and slipped it into an envelope. But a letter felt like too little, too late. He remembered the plate of food she had given away, the moment she had chosen hunger over turning her back on strangers. That image had burned itself into him. So he tried to echo it. He packed a simple meal, rice, beans, stew, cooked clumsily in his pristine kitchen, the smells filling his sterile apartment with life for the first time. He carried it in a plain container, no luxury packaging, no symbols of wealth. Just food, humble and heartfelt. Meanwhile, Ayana sat on her bed, her own doubts gnawing at her. She replayed his words, but also his actions. The way he had laughed at himself, the way he had tied that red cloth around his wrist, the way he had listened when no one else had ever cared to. Her pride told her to close the door forever. But her heart whispered that maybe people could change. Maybe he already had. The knock on her door startled her. She froze, pulse racing, torn between hope and dread. When she finally opened it, there he was. No expensive suit, no polished mask, just Nathaniel, holding a container in both hands, as though it were the most important thing he had ever carried. I don't deserve to ask you to open your door again, he said, voice rough. But I had to try. You gave away your meal when you had nothing. This is me, trying to give something back. No headlines. No image. Just me. Her breath caught. She wanted to slam the door, to protect herself. But then she looked at him, really looked. His eyes weren't polished or proud. They were tired, vulnerable, pleading. She took the container with trembling hands, then noticed the envelope tucked beneath it. Please read it, he whispered. She closed the door, back pressed against the wood, heart pounding. The smell of the food filled her tiny apartment, pulling tears to her eyes. She opened the letter, and as her eyes moved over his words, her walls cracked again. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking. Pride battled with longing, fear with hope. Finally, she rose, opened the door once more, and found him still waiting, as though he'd known she'd come back. The air between them was thick with everything unsaid. She held out the letter, her voice soft but steady. You hurt me. I know, he said. And I'll spend as long as it takes proving I won't again. Her throat tightened, but she stepped aside, just enough for him to enter. Do you believe vulnerability is stronger than pride? Would you open the door again if you were Ayana? Or would you walk away? Comment below. Nathaniel stepped into her world with none of his former armor. The silence between them was fragile, thick with the weight of wounds and tentative hope. He looked around the room, the peeling paint, the cracked floor, the patched blanket on the couch, and for the first time, he didn't see lack. He saw resilience, history, a place that had been held together by someone who refused to give up, no matter how much the world tried to strip her of dignity. Ayanna stood with her arms folded, shoulders tense, as though bracing for him to slip into the role of benefactor again. But he didn't. Instead, he set the container of food on her small table and sat down quietly, like a man who had come not to rescue, but to stay. "I don't have all the answers," he admitted. His voice was unsteady, stripped of its usual confidence. "I've spent years thinking success meant control, money, appearances. But none of it matters if I can't sit here, across from you, and be real." Ayanna lowered herself onto the chair opposite him. She studied his face, the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, the vulnerability in his posture. He wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't hiding behind wealth. For once, he looked like a man who had nothing to give but himself. That truth softened something inside her. "You hurt me," she repeated, but her voice cracked this time. "I know," he said. "And I'll hurt again, not because I want to, but because I'm human. The only promise I can make is that I'll face it with you. Not above you. Not rescuing you. Just with you." Her eyes blurred with tears she fought to hold back. "Do you even understand what it costs to trust again?" "Yes," he whispered. "Because I'm asking the same of you." For a long moment, neither moved. Then Ayanna reached for the container, opened it, and the smell of rice and stew filled the room. It was clumsy, unevenly cooked, even a little burnt at the edges, but her lips curved despite herself. "You really tried to cook this?" He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Tried is the right word. Turns out, boiling rice is harder than signing million-dollar contracts." That broke something heavy between them, and she laughed, soft, shaky, but real. They ate together, not in silence this time, but with the beginnings of peace threading through their words. It echoed the moment in the diner, where she had given up her meal for strangers. Only now, she wasn't giving away, she was receiving. She let herself eat without guilt, without shame, while his gaze stayed steady, not with pity, but with quiet admiration. Days turned into weeks. Their bond was not sudden magic, it was daily choices. He helped patch her roof, not by hiring contractors, but by climbing the ladder himself, blistering his palms, learning what it meant to work alongside her. She teased him for his clumsiness, but each nail he hammered was a vow. She, in turn, allowed herself to lean, not for survival, but for companionship. She let him hold her when nights were too heavy, let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she was worthy of love that stayed. One evening, Nathaniel brought her back to the little diner where it all began. The owner, recognizing them, greeted them with a knowing smile. This time, they didn't sit alone. He invited the elderly couple too, the ones she had sacrificed for. Plates arrived, not one, but many, steaming and abundant. Nathaniel raised his glass of water, his eyes finding Ayanna's. "To the meal that changed everything," he said. Ayanna's throat tightened, tears threatening. She looked at the couple, at the spread of food, at the man beside her, and felt something she had never dared, fullness. Not just of stomach, but of soul. The woman she once was, the girl who gave away her only meal, had not vanished. She was still here, only now, she didn't have to starve to prove her worth. She had found someone who saw her sacrifice not as weakness, but as strength. Someone who had been hollow despite wealth, now whole because of love. She reached across the table, fingers brushing Nathaniel's. "You know," she said softly, "love doesn't mean rescuing. It means choosing. Every day." He squeezed her hand gently. "Then let's keep choosing." And they did, imperfectly, vulnerably, but truthfully. She gave when it hurt. He gave when it mattered. Together, they discovered that the greatest wealth was not in money, not even in sacrifice, but in the courage to be seen and loved for exactly who they were. If this story touched your heart, tell me, would you give when it hurts? Or do you believe that love itself is the greatest reward? Comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story moved you, the next one will hit even deeper. It's more gripping, more unexpected, and waiting for you right now. Don't hesitate. Click the video on your screen, and I'll see you in the next story.